Imagine you're flipping through the channels, maybe looking for something mindless to watch while you eat your dinner, and you stumble onto GB News, where Matt Goodwin is having what can only be described as a full-blown meltdown at former Labour MP Bill Rammell. We're not talking about a polite disagreement here. We're talking eye-rolling, voice-raising, talking over each other, have the decency to listen level chaos. And all of this is happening because yet another person has been killed by someone who, according to Goodwin and many others, shouldn't have been in the country in the first place. Haybe Cabdiraxmaan Nur was jailed for fatally stabbing a bank customer in May, and this case has become the lightning rod for a much bigger, much angrier debate about borders, deportations, human rights, and whether the government has any clue what it's doing. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we break down the political explosions so you can understand what's actually going on beneath all the shouting. Today, we're diving into this absolutely wild GB News row and what it reveals about the deep divisions and how Britain thinks about immigration and border control. Right, let's set the stage. Matt Goodwin, who's a political commentator and GB News host, known for not exactly holding back his opinions, invited Bill Rammell onto his show. Rammell is a former Labour MP, so you can already see where this is heading. You've got someone who thinks the government isn't doing nearly enough on immigration versus someone who's going to defend Labour's record. It's like mixing vinegar and baking soda and then acting surprised when it explodes. From the very start, Goodwin came out swinging. He's furious that the community is being divided, that women and children are being put at risk, and he demands that Rammell and Labour admit there's a problem and actually do something about it. Not just talk about doing something, not just announce new policies that sound good in press releases, but actually do something tangible that makes British people safer. Now, Rammell's response was predictable. He pushed back, defending Labour by saying they are doing things about it, specifically mentioning that deportations are being increased, which, fair enough, is technically doing something. But here's where things started getting spicy. As Rammell continued his defense of the government, Goodwin started rolling his eyes, actually rolling his eyes on live television. And then he started shaking his head and saying, "Bill," in that tone that immediately tells you someone's patience has completely evaporated. You know that tone. It's the same one your parents used when you were a kid and they'd had enough of your excuses. It's the verbal equivalent of throwing your hands up in frustration. Goodwin then started speaking over Rammell, which is always a sign that a debate has gone completely off the rails. And he said something beautifully simple. "Bill, just control the borders." 3 words. Control the borders. And in those 3 words, you can hear the frustration of millions of people who feel like successive governments have completely failed on this issue. Because here's the thing, border control is supposed to be one of the most fundamental responsibilities of any government. You're supposed to know who's coming into your country, why they're coming, and whether they should be allowed to stay. It's not a radical concept. Every country on earth does this to some degree. But in Britain, it feels like we've somehow made this impossibly complicated. Goodwin then launched into a list of things he doesn't want, which prompted Rammell to fire back with, "You don't want to engage in the real world, Matt." Which is a delicious accusation, because both of them think they're the one living in the real world and the other one is delusional. Goodwin's real world is one where borders need to be closed and controlled, where people who arrive illegally should be detained and deported, where British citizens' safety should be the absolute top priority. Rammell's real world is one where you can't just close borders without massive economic and diplomatic consequences, where human rights obligations exist for good reasons, and where simple solutions to complex problems don't actually work. They're basically having 2 completely different conversations while using the same words. Then Goodwin drops his first big policy prescription, leave the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. Now, this is where we need to pause and unpack, because this has become the nuclear option in British immigration debates. The ECHR is an international treaty that sets out fundamental human rights and freedoms that member countries are obligated to protect. Britain helped draft it after World War II. It's been in force since the 1950s, and it covers things like the right to life, prohibition of torture, right to a fair trial, and so on. But in recent years, it's become increasingly controversial because it's been used to block deportations of people who've committed crimes or arrived illegally, with courts ruling that deporting them would violate their human rights. For people like Goodwin, the ECHR has become the symbol of everything wrong with Britain's approach to immigration. It's seen as prioritizing the rights of foreign criminals over the safety of British citizens. For people like Rammell, leaving the ECHR would be a catastrophic mistake that would damage Britain's international reputation, undermine human rights protections, and probably wouldn't even solve the immigration issues anyway. And crucially, Rammell claimed that the majority of people in the country support being a member of the ECHR, which Goodwin clearly thinks is absolute nonsense. As Rammell tried to respond, Goodwin exploded with, "You asked me a question," demanding the space to finish his point, which is fair, to be honest. If you ask someone how they'd fix something, you should probably let them answer before jumping in with counter-arguments. The debate then devolved into what can only be described as a flurry of rage, with both men raising their voices and talking over each other. It's the kind of television that's simultaneously compelling and exhausting to watch. Eventually, Goodwin managed to regain control long enough to demand, "Have the decency to listen," which is a phrase that should probably be embroidered on a pillow and placed in every political debate studio in the country. Once he actually had the floor, Goodwin laid out his full prescription: leave the ECHR, repeal Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, detain and deport anyone who arrives in the UK illegally, and actually start putting the people of this country first. It's a hardline position, no question about it. But here's what makes this debate so interesting and so revealing. Goodwin genuinely believes these are obvious steps that any reasonable government should take to protect its citizens. From his perspective, the fact that Labour won't do these things isn't because they're impractical or wouldn't work, but because of ideology. Because, as he put it, the left puts universal human rights ahead of British people, prioritizing people who aren't from our country over our own people. This is the crux of the argument, really. It's not actually about the technical details of immigration policy or the legal intricacies of the ECHR. It's about fundamental values and priorities. Goodwin's position is essentially British citizens first, always, and if that means leaving international treaties or taking hardline enforcement actions, so be it. Rammell's position, representing the Labour Party view, is that you can't just abandon human rights commitments, that Britain has international obligations, and that there are ways to manage immigration and improve security without torching the entire framework of human rights protections. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because Goodwin's frustration is rooted in a real tragedy. Another person has lost their life, as he said. Someone died because someone who potentially shouldn't have been in the country was able to commit murder. That's not a hypothetical policy debate. That's a real human cost. And when you're the family member of someone killed in these circumstances, abstract discussions about human rights conventions probably feel completely irrelevant. You just want to know why the system failed to prevent this tragedy and what's going to change so it doesn't happen again. But here's the other side of that coin, the part that Rammell would argue: Britain can't make policy based solely on the worst-case scenarios. Every system will have failures. Every country, no matter how strict their border controls, will occasionally allow in someone who goes on to commit serious crimes. You could have the most draconian border system imaginable, and you still wouldn't prevent every single bad actor from entering the country. The question isn't whether you can create a perfect system, because you can't. The question is what level of risk is acceptable, and what measures are you willing to take to minimize that risk. Leaving the ECHR, for example, sounds straightforward until you think through the consequences. Britain would be the only major European democracy outside of it alongside Russia and Belarus, which is not exactly great company. It would damage our diplomatic relationships, potentially complicate trade negotiations, and raise serious questions about Britain's commitment to human rights. British citizens traveling abroad would lose certain protections. It would create legal chaos, as thousands of cases that reference ECHR provisions would need to be relitigated. And crucially, it probably wouldn't actually solve the immigration problem, because most asylum claims are processed under separate international conventions that Britain would still be party to. Repealing the Human Rights Act is similarly complicated. The act doesn't create new rights. It incorporates the ECHR into British law so that people can bring cases in UK courts rather than having to go to Strasbourg. Repealing it would mean courts couldn't consider human rights arguments, but the ECHR would still apply, so people would just have to take their cases to the European Court of Human Rights. It would be slower, more expensive, and wouldn't change the ultimate outcomes. It's a symbolic gesture more than a practical solution. And detaining and deporting everyone who arrives illegally sounds simple until you think about the infrastructure required. Where are you going to detain potentially tens of thousands of people? How much is that going to cost? Which countries are you going to deport them to, especially if those countries won't accept them back? What about people fleeing genuine persecution who have valid asylum claims? Do they get processed first, or do you just deport them and ask questions later? These aren't hypothetical problems. They're the real-world complications that make immigration policy so difficult. But none of that matters to Goodwin in this moment, and you can understand why. He's looking at a specific case where someone died, someone who might be alive if border controls were stricter, and he's furious that politicians like Rammell are still making excuses. From his perspective, every complication, every legal obstacle, every international obligation is just another excuse for inaction. And there's a significant chunk of the British public who agrees with him. They're tired of being told why things can't be done. They want politicians who will say, yes, there will be consequences, but we're going to do it anyway, because protecting British citizens is more important. This is what makes this row so representative. It's not just two blokes shouting at each other on television, it's